This movie covers subtopic 1.3, Energy and Equilibria, under the main topic of IB ESS Topic 1, Foundations of Environmental Systems and Societies. The significant idea number 1 for this subtopic is, the laws of thermodynamics govern the flow of energy in a system and the ability to do work. The first law of thermodynamics is the principle of conservation of energy, which states that energy in an isolated system can be transformed but cannot be created or destroyed. For the context of this course, we will be considering the universe as our isolated system. The total energy in the entire universe remains constant. In this image, food is not destroyed as it enters the human and passes through the digestive system. It is transformed into growth of the human, energy for activity like movement, thinking, and living. It's transformed into waste or lost heat through respiration. Likewise, sunlight is not destroyed as it enters the plant. It is transformed into growth of the plant or lost heat in respiration. In both cases, energy is neither created nor destroyed. It's simply transformed into other forms of energy. This is an illustration of the first law of thermodynamics. Before we go on, I need to tell you a little secret about sunlight. A brief note on sunlight. You need to be aware that not all of sun's energy is used for photosynthesis. About 51% of sun's radiation penetrates the atmosphere and actually reaches Earth. Of the 49% that does not reach the Earth, 30% is reflected back into space, and 19% is absorbed by the atmosphere and clouds. In fact, only 0.023% of the sun's energy actually is used for photosynthesis. Keep this fact in the back of your minds as you go through the course. Again, not all of the sun's energy is used for photosynthesis. And back to thermodynamics. In this example, coal energy is transformed into electrical energy via heat energy and mechanical energy. And of course, finally, the electrical energy. The electrical energy is not created, and the coal energy is not destroyed. It is simply transformed. The second law of thermodynamics states that the entropy of an isolated system, not in equilibrium, will tend to increase over time. Entropy is a measure of the amount of disorder in a system. In this image, on the left, we have an example of high disorder, or high entropy. As we progress towards the right, the spheres become more ordered. High order means low entropy. Higher disorder or disorganization means high entropy. The more organized or ordered something is, the lower the entropy. In each of these two images, which has higher energy? Which has higher energy? The glass of crushed ice might look more disordered. However, the molecules of water within the ice are much more organized as compared to the molecules in the liquid water. Thus, the glass of water is more disordered and has higher entropy. The pile of bricks on the right side is much more disorganized, thus has higher entropy than this stacked pile of bricks. Recall, the second law of thermodynamics states that the entropy of an isolated system, not in equilibrium, will tend to increase over time. In the example of the bricks, if you have a pile of bricks and you throw them into the air, what is more likely to happen? Will they fall into a nice, orderly stack like this? Or will they fall into a disordered pile like this? Of course, it is much more likely that they will fall into a disordered pile like this. The entropy of a pile of bricks thrown into the air will increase over time. Take the example of your bedroom, which is a metaphor for the second law of thermodynamics. not actually predicted by the law. It's merely an attempt to help you wrap your head around the concept. The room starts out tidy, low entropy, and then over time becomes more disordered, or higher disorder, higher entropy. The entropy of the room increases over time. The only way to return to a state of order or low entropy is to input energy to clean it up. You must understand that energy conversions are never 100% efficient. As such, an increase in entropy arising from energy transformation reduces the energy available to do work. The efficiency of converting solar energy to stored sugars is about 1 to 2%. Herbivores, on an average, only assimilate 10% of the total plant energy they consume. The rest of the energy is used in metabolic processes, such as cellular respiration, and in biological activities, such as thinking, growing, breathing, pumping blood, and running away from predators. This changes the stored chemical energy in its cells into useful work, like running and walking. But during this movement, the stored energy is converted to heat and lost from the food chain. A carnivore's efficiency is also only about 10%. Just like the herbivore, the carnivore loses energy to metabolic processes and biological activities like eating, sleeping, and chasing the herbivore. This means the carnivore's total efficiency in the food chain is only about 0.0002%, right, in the total food chain. The heat energy has higher entropy than the original energy input. Less and less energy is available as you move up the food chain because more and more of it is released into the environment as heat, as energy with higher entropy. Efficiency is defined as the useful energy, the work or output produced by a process, divided by the amount of energy consumed, being the input to the process. So useful output divided by input, multiply by 100% if you want to express it in a percentage. You can apply the formula of efficiency to this example. Convince yourself of the efficiency of energy transformation for the herbivore. There is an input of 10 joules and a useful output of 1 joule. Thus, the efficiency is 10%. Stop the movie and make sure you understand the math for the carnivore also, where the little h here stands for herbivore and the C stands for carnivore. You need to be able to explain the implications of the laws of thermodynamics to ecological systems. The next 2 slides will help you with this task. The principle of conservation of energy can be modeled by the energy transformation along food chain and energy production systems. For example, in this image, the energy enters the system as light energy. Photosynthesis converts light energy to stored chemical energy, or glucose. The stored chemical energy is then passed along the food chain as food. No new energy is created, it is transformed. Chemical energy is metabolized and is lost from the food chain as heat. But nowhere is energy created or destroyed. It's simply transformed into different forms along the food chain. The second law of thermodynamics explains the inefficiency and decrease in available energy along a food chain and energy generation systems. For example, of the 10,000 kcal stored in the producers, most of the energy is lost as heat through the process of respiration. This heat energy has higher entropy than the glucose stored in the plants. Thus, only 10% is available for the herbivore. Of the 1,000 kcal stored in the herbivore, most of the energy is lost as heat energy through the process of cellular respiration. And again, this heat energy has a much higher entropy than the rabbit itself. The tendency towards increased entropy, right, this loss of heat, results in energy being unavailable as you move up the food chain because it's all been lost along the way. You need to be able to explain how the first and second laws of thermodynamics are seen in a diagram like this. Study the last two slides to make sure you can explain how this image illustrates the first and second laws of thermodynamics. The first law states that energy can be transformed from one form to another, not created or destroyed. For example, this is seen in the transformation of solar energy to chemical energy in the process of photosynthesis. Here is another example for you. A second example of the first law of thermodynamics is seen in food chains. Energy is transformed as it passes along the food chain. It is neither destroyed nor created. You need to know that food chains show how energy passes through an ecosystem. We will do more work with food chains in topic 2.2. The second law of thermodynamics establishes that energy transformation processes are not 100% efficient. 90% of chemical energy is lost to heat energy. Heat energy is not a useful form of energy. You can't eat heat. Energy lost through inefficient transfer of organic matter, gaseous, urinary, and fecal losses, is also a way that energy is lost. Take a moment to stop the movie and study this figure, to look at how energy is utilized in a biological system. It's used for biosynthesis to make molecules to build or repair tissue. It's used for maintenance of the organism. It's used to create mechanical work like thinking and moving and going to find food. And all of these events are inefficient, releasing energy in the form of heat to the environment. Furthermore, energy is lost through organic matter, such as feces and urine and sweat and gases. Due to the laws of thermodynamics, the efficiency of energy transformation is low in ecological systems. This is a result of all the energy lost in the transformation processes occurring in biological systems. Is it more efficient to eat a plant or an animal? Of the original 1,000 joules of light energy, 1 joule is available to the herbivore, but only 0.1 joule is available to the carnivore. What are the implications here of the laws of thermodynamics? Moving on to significant idea number 2 from this subtopic. Systems can exist in alternative stable states or as equilibria between which there are tipping points. Right? 2 different equilibria here. Equilibrium is the tendency of a system to return to an original state following a disturbance. At equilibrium, a state of balance exists among the components of a system. In this image, you see a boreal forest 1 year and 2 years after a forest fire. It is slowly returning to its original state following a disturbance. In an open system, an ecosystem will normally exist in stable equilibrium, either a steady state or one developing over time, like succession, which we will talk about in topic 2, and is maintained by stabilizing negative feedback loops. Steady state equilibrium is a characteristic of open systems where there are continuous inputs and outputs of energy and matter, but the whole system as a whole remains in a more or less constant state. In this example, in both images, the flow of water into the bucket is similar to the flow of water out. Therefore, the relative level of the bucket stays constant. A steady state equilibrium you are familiar with is the ability of humans to maintain constant body temperature through sweating to cool ourselves or shivering to warm ourselves. You know this as homeostasis. In this example, between the years of 1845 and 1925, the fox population was at a steady state equilibrium. The number of births and deaths were mostly equal, thus maintaining the population size at approximately 1.6 million. All of the inputs and outputs of this forest ecosystem balance. The forest basically always looks the same over long periods of time. Thus, it is at a steady state equilibrium. Static equilibrium is a state in which there is no change over time. Most non-living systems are in a state of static equilibrium. The position of the rocks or building components do not change their position or state. They look the same over long periods of time. Unlike the forest, where trees die and grow over time, nothing really changes in these examples of static equilibrium. In stable equilibrium, the system tends to return to the same equilibrium after a disturbance. In this example, following a disturbance, the ball returns to its original state. It's a stable equilibrium. In an unstable equilibrium, the system returns to a new equilibrium after a disturbance. In this example, following a disturbance, the ball is going to take a new place and will be at a new equilibrium. A change that results in a new equilibrium is referred to as a tipping point. An ecological tipping point is reached when an ecosystem experiences a shift to a new state in which there are significant changes to its biodiversity and services it provides. In this image, you see a shift from a coral-dominated ecosystem to an algae-dominated ecosystem. The threshold illustrated a point at which where there was a fast shift of ecological state to the algae-dominated system. These changes are long-lasting and difficult to reverse. You need to be able to evaluate the possible consequences of tipping points. Remember, a tipping point means that there is a threshold beyond which a fast shift of ecological state occurs. The threshold point cannot be precisely predicted. The changes are long and lasting. The changes are difficult to reverse, and there is a significant lag time between the pressures driving the change and the appearance of the impacts, creating difficulties in ecological management. The Triftgletscher in Berner Oberland of Switzerland recently filled the entire basin, seen here in the foreground. Thinning of the tongue of the glacier during the 1900s accelerated, and as of 2001, a lake started to form in front of it. The ice became buoyant, and rapid breakup of the snout is now underway. This long-lasting effect that is difficult to reverse is a consequence of climate change. Nutrients from agricultural practices leach into freshwater systems. Added nutrients can cause excessive growth of algae, called an algae bloom. Light is then blocked from plants below, causing them to die, resulting in lower oxygen levels in the lake and death of organisms. A new state is reached. This process is called eutrophication. And when you have a lot of dead animals resulting from this, it's called a dead zone. Coral is a keystone species, meaning that many other organisms depend on it for life. When coral is lost due to bleaching, seen here, a consequence of climate change, other organisms will disappear as well. Again, a tipping point has been reached. It's long-lasting and difficult to reverse. Significant idea number 2. Destabilizing positive feedback mechanisms will drive toward these tipping points, whereas stabilizing negative feedback mechanisms will resist such changes. Negative feedback loops are stabilizing. They occur when the output of a process inhibits or reverses the operation of the same process in such a way to reduce or change. It counteracts deviation. It returns the system to original equilibrium. The body's response to temperature change is a classic example of negative feedback. In the response to heating, the process of sweating returns the body to normal. And in response to cold, shivering helps return the body temperature to normal. When graphing a negative feedback response, you'll see a curve like this. A disturbance happens, and negative feedback brings it back to the original state. A disturbance happens, and negative feedback brings it to the original state, and so on and so forth. Another example of negative feedback would be that increased temperatures cause more evaporation. More evaporation results in formation of clouds, especially the low clouds, which actually reflect more sunlight. More sunlight reflected then lowers temperatures. A classic example of negative feedback loop is found in the predator-prey relationships. As good weather yields good grasses, the rabbit populations rise. They are food for the foxes, whose population also rises. But as they consume the rabbit population lowers. With less rabbits, the fox population also declines. With declining fox populations, the rabbit populations can rise again. As rabbit numbers go up, so do fox numbers, and foxes eat the rabbits, and then there are less rabbits, and so on and so forth. Again, this is a classical example of negative feedback loops, the predator-prey relationships. Negative feedback loops tend to maintain stable equilibrium. They counteract change. However, positive feedback loops are destabilizing and will tend to amplify the changes. An example of positive feedback mechanism is rising temperatures cause increased ice melting. Less ice results in less albedo, or reflection of sun's rays by the ice. Therefore, increasing temperature further increases more ice melt. Less ice means less albedo, and so forth. Another example of positive feedback mechanism is the introduction of water hyacinth to a freshwater lake or pond. One hyacinth becomes 2, which becomes 4, which becomes 8, and so on and so forth, until you have an entire pond or lake filled with hyacinth. You need to be able to discuss the resilience in a variety of systems. Ecological resilience is the ability of an ecosystem to respond to some kind of disturbance. It's a measure of how quickly it recovers. There are two main ways to measure resilience: by looking at the time it takes for an ecosystem to return to any stable state, or how well a system can absorb a change and keep the same function and structure. This latter method acknowledges that a system can be stable, yet still unhealthy. Disturbances can be natural or human-made. Fires, floods, storms, sudden introduction of new species, or sudden population explosion of current species are natural impacts that can be studied in terms of resilience. But human impacts like climate change, deforestation, oil extraction, toxic chemicals, and introducing exotic species are also part of measuring resilience. In an article titled Ecological Resilience, Biodiversity, and Scale, a model is described in which resilience of an ecosystem correlates with the number of different species or species richness that exist in the ecosystem. Furthermore, the more species there are that have a large ecological impact, the ones identified as driver species, the more resilient an ecosystem is. If there are a lot of different species with different ecological roles, there is a greater likelihood that there is a species that can replace another if it dies out, and so the system can maintain equilibrium. Resilience correlates with increased functions by different species. In the same article, Ecological Resilience, Biodiversity, and Scale, this data shows that if a forest ecosystem has both large and small seed dispersers, the forest will be resilient to both small and large disturbances. Stop the video and study the data to make sure you understand how it correlates with resilience. More complex ecosystems are more resilient. The more species there are, the more food chains there are, the more complex food webs there are, the more resilient the ecosystem will be. The more genetic diversity or more variety a species has, the more resilience it will have. If you have only one variety of a species, the entire species could be wiped out by a disease. Whereas if you have a lot of variety within one species, there is a likelihood that one of the varieties will be resistant to any disease that comes through. If a species has a wide range of habitat geography, it will also have more resilience. Imagine if the habitat of this fish crow were disrupted in one region. The bird would be fine because it can survive in so many other places. Resilience is typically a good thing when we are talking about endemic species or intact ecosystems. But it can also be bad if we are talking about pathogenic bacteria, or what about this invasive species of plant, kudzu, native to Japan, but taking over this forest in the southeast United States. This is a kind of resilience we don't want to have to deal with. Here is a summary of all the concepts we've discussed in topic 1.2. This ends the movie for IB ESS topic 1.3, Energy and Equilibria, under the main topic 1 of Foundations in Environmental Systems and Societies. The slides were created by me, Dr. Nina Markham. Images are courtesy of Creative Commons, unless otherwise indicated with a citation under the image. If all images on a slide are from the same source, the source is simply cited at the bottom of the slide. Another resource source for you is your IB ESS textbook, whether in hardback or in online form such as Cognity. Thank you for listening.